March 1942. A smoke-filled wardroom aboard the cruiser Atago, flagship of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's Second Fleet. The officers, still riding the momentum of victories from Malaya to the Philippines, leaned over maps of the Solomon Islands while stewards refilled cups of green tea. A junior staff officer, fresh from Tokyo, mentioned an American weapon reportedly deployed in the Philippines, fast motor torpedo boats, only 80 feet long, built of plywood, crewed by a dozen men. The reaction was laughter. Captain Tamechi Hara, later to survive the war, recalled in his memoirs that the very idea of such craft being a weapon against the Imperial Navy seemed absurd. They were toys, not warships. A staff officer jokingly asked whether the Americans planned to defeat the Emperor's fleet with fishing boats. Another quipped that perhaps Roosevelt's boys would row across the Pacific once the gasoline ran out. In Japanese naval slang, the boats became komarigumo, mosquito craft. The term carried contempt. Mosquitoes bite but do not kill. The phrase plywood mosquitoes circulated in intelligence reports, a mocking nod to the fact that these craft were sheathed not in steel but in layers of laminated mahogany. Against cruisers displacing 10,000 tons, armoured with inches of steel and armed with 8-inch guns firing shells, the weight of a man, such mosquitoes seemed beneath notice. Yet in Washington, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships and the newly created motor torpedo boat squadrons saw things differently. Memos preserved in the Naval History and Heritage Command files, H. Graham 018, outlined their doctrine. PT boats would not slug it out with battleships. They would strike at night in narrow waters, ambush convoys, raid anchorages. Their advantage lay not in armour but in speed, 40 knots, faster than any cruiser, and in the punch of 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each capable of breaking the back of a destroyer. A June 1942 memorandum stated plainly, "The mission of PT units is harassment, denial of freedom of movement, and destruction of enemy surface vessels disproportionate to their own size." The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, Japanese heavy cruisers like Mogami, 11,200 tons standard displacement, powered by 10 Campon boilers delivering 152,000 shaft horsepower, main battery 15 6-inch guns, secondary batteries, torpedoes, armour belt up to 4.1 inches. Designed for decisive fleet action, they embodied the battleship doctrine still dominant in Tokyo. On the other, the American Elco 80-foot PT boat, standard displacement 56 tons, 3 Packard gasoline engines generating 4,500 horsepower, crew of 12 to 17, armament 4 21-inch torpedoes in roll-off racks, 2 twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns, occasionally a 20mm Oerlikon if available. Fuel capacity, 3,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline, liquid fire stored beneath thin decks of wood. A single Japanese cruiser cost the equivalent of $10 million to build. A PT boat, less than $300,000. The Americans could produce dozens for the price of one enemy cruiser. But in the spring of 1942, the men of the combined fleet did not measure war in such terms. They measured it in displacement, armour thickness, gun calibre, the thunder of broadsides. Captured interrogation records from 1945 confirm the scorn. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi told Allied officers after surrender, "We never feared the motorboats. Our view was that any destroyer could brush them aside, any cruiser could obliterate them with one salvo. They were an annoyance, not a threat." Commander Toshikazu Omai, operations officer for the 8th Fleet, echoed him. "In staff conferences we treated them as nothing. They were regarded as expendable nuisances, like insects. But the Americans persisted. The 339th Fighter Squadron's history of 1942 to 1943 records that when Army pilots arrived in the Solomons, they were surprised to see flotillas of these boats lurking in Tulagi harbour, painted dark green, bristling with machine guns. "They looked fragile," one pilot wrote. like toy boats a boy might build. Yet the sailors spoke of them with deadly seriousness. The contempt of the Japanese mirrored, in eerie foreshadowing, the German laughter at the P-47 milk bottle or the Soviet dismissal of American luxury rations. War has always bred arrogance toward the unfamiliar. To the men of the rising sun, whose training had drilled into them reverence for steel hulls and long-range gunnery duels, the idea that plywood craft could challenge the masters of Tsushima seemed ludicrous. Yet in naval warfare, as in industrial warfare at large, appearances deceive. A torpedo did not care whether it was launched from a destroyer, a submarine, or a boat built of wood. The Mark 8 carried 386 pounds of TNT in its warhead, enough to gut any cruiser afloat. If 4 such torpedoes struck, even the vaunted Yamato would stagger. The PT boat's purpose was not survival in a stand-up fight, but to deliver that blow, then vanish into the night at 40 knots, leaving confusion and fire in its wake. But none of this mattered to the admirals of 1942. In their worldview, tiny craft could never threaten the battle line. During the April staff review in Truk, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa dismissed intelligence reports of PT deployments in the Solomons as laughable. His war diary, later captured and translated by the Allied translator and interpreter section, noted, "Enemy motorcraft insignificant. No countermeasures required beyond vigilance of destroyer patrols." This complacency would cost dearly. For the very arrogance with which the Japanese dismissed the Mosquito fleet blinded them to its strategic role. PT boats could not sink the combined fleet in open battle. But they could, and soon would, bleed Japan's supply lines, harass destroyers, and, in the dark waters of the Solomons, strike even at cruisers thought untouchable. The laughter of 1942 thus belongs to the prelude of a lesson in humility. Like Hansfeld's 50,000 gallons or the P-47's milk bottle fuselage, the mockery reveals more about the mockers than the mocked. When admirals in polished wardrooms laughed at plywood mosquitoes, they were laughing at America's improvisation, its willingness to deploy weapons that seemed absurd until tested. War would test them soon enough. The Japanese laughed at plywood. The Americans built with it. The motor torpedo boat, what sailors came to call simply the PT, was not born from battleship admirals or carrier strategists, but from improvisers, tinkerers, even yacht designers. In the 1930s, the US Navy ran small competitions for motor torpedo boat designs, hoping to find a vessel light enough to be fast, cheap enough to be mass-produced, and dangerous enough to make an enemy think twice. The prototypes looked more like pleasure craft than warships. They had open cockpits, wooden hulls, and engines borrowed from civilian speedboats. When war came, industry transformed these fragile racers into weapons. Elco of Bayonne, New Jersey, and Higgins Industries of New Orleans turned out the most successful models. The Elco 80-footer became iconic. 3 Packard Fe 12 engines, originally designed for aircraft, gave the craft astonishing speed. A Navy test memo of August 1941 noted proudly, "Boat attained 41 knots on trial run, maneuverability excellent, seakeeping adequate for tropical service." Adequate. No one pretended they were comfortable. Crews baked under tin roofs by day, froze in wet salt spray at night. But the Navy did not intend comfort. It intended ambush. "Guerrillas of the sea," one designer called them. Doctrine called for the boats to lie inshore, camouflaged, then dart out at night to launch torpedoes against unsuspecting ships. Their virtue was surprise. A battleship broadcast its presence in horizon-long silhouettes. A PT boat could hide in mangrove shallows, blacked out, invisible until it spat torpedoes. In this sense, they were cousins to the submarine. But unlike submarines, PTS cost almost nothing, required no exotic machinery, and could be built by hundreds. A Lockheed engineer visiting Higgins's yard in 1942 remarked that We could lose 5 a month and not notice the budget. One boat took 60 days to build. The United States produced more than 12,000 aircraft a month by 1943. Producing 100 PT boats in the same span seemed trivial. The irony is that not all Americans believed in them either. Battleship admirals sneered at sea mosquitoes as readily as their Japanese counterparts. A 1940 memo from Admiral Harold Stark's office complained, "Unfit for fleet operations, fragile, ill-armed, lacking seaworthiness." Even when PTS scored early successes in the Philippines, harassing Japanese landings at Bataan, many senior officers dismissed them as accidents of circumstance, but Franklin D. Roosevelt did not. The President, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, took a personal interest in the craft. He had once cruised on fast yachts of similar size, and he believed in their possibilities. When skeptics in the Navy resisted mass production, Roosevelt intervened directly, instructing the Bureau of Ships to expand contracts with Elco and Higgins. In wartime America, presidential enthusiasm equaled industrial destiny. Thus, the Mosquito Fleet came into being. Squadrons were organized, motor torpedo boat squadrons 1 through 40. Each squadron held 12 boats supported by a tender ship. By mid-1942, PT boats were deployed to the Philippines, the Aleutians, the Solomons and New Guinea. Their crews were often young, naval reservists, Ivy League athletes, small-town fishermen. John F. Kennedy, who would later ride history from PT 109, was only one of many well-educated volunteers drawn to the glamour of fast boats and night combat. Contrast again defined the reality. A Japanese heavy cruiser like Ioba displaced 8,300 tons and required over 700 men to operate. Its main guns hurled 100-kilogram shells 27 kilometers. It took years to build and consumed vast shipyard resources. A PT boat, 80 feet long, displaced 56 tons and required only 15 men. Its main weapon was not a shell, but the Mark 8 torpedo, 3,841 pounds of steel, propelled by a wet heater engine at 36 knots, carrying a warhead of 386 pounds of TNT. If one struck, it could flood a cruiser's engine room, snap propeller shafts, or detonate fuel bunkers. In cost terms, for the price of one cruiser, America could produce over 30 PT boats. Each cruiser sunk or disabled by one was not merely a tactical success. It was a staggering return on investment. The Japanese, however, did not think in ratios. Their doctrine still imagined the decisive fleet battle of Tsushima, line against line, steel against steel. Plywood did not enter the equation. Captured interrogation transcripts underscore this blind spot. Commander Toshio Miyazaki, interviewed in 1946, admitted, "We heard of your small boats, but thought them of no consequence. Our naval doctrine emphasized battleships and carriers. We never conceived that small craft could sink a cruiser." Yet the Americans had conceived it. PT squadron doctrine manuals survive in the National Archives. They emphasize not frontal assault, but harassment. One passage reads, "The purpose of PT employment is to interfere continually with enemy operations. The enemy must be denied rest. Every convoy must be forced to maneuver. Every anchorage must be unsafe. The mosquito bites not to kill, but to exhaust. Enough bites, however, may bring down even the strongest." That phrase, "enough bites may bring down even the strongest," could have been the motto of the entire fleet. Crews, of course, joked about the fragility of their craft. Floating fuel tanks, one sailor called them. With 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline stored below deck, a single tracer round could set them ablaze. Many PT crews carried pistols, not only for boarding but to shoot at the fuel if trapped, preferring instant death to burning alive. Yet the same fragility gave them speed. A PT at flank speed could weave among reefs and shoals inaccessible to destroyers. In this paradox lay their power. Fragile yet deadly, expendable yet priceless. The Solomons would soon prove it. But in the spring of 1942, the Mosquito fleet was still a rumour to the Japanese, lines in intelligence reports exaggerated by anxious pilots, dismissed by admirals in Tokyo. It existed in Washington memos, in shipyard floor plans, in the grey paint drying on wooden hulls at Higgins and Elco. It was a doctrine in waiting, a fleet in chrysalis. As with the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Germans mocked the fat fuselage until it rained fire on them. As with the Coca-Cola bottle in Stalag 9, the Soviets mocked American indulgence until they drank it. So too did the Japanese mock plywood until torpedo wakes curled white through the night toward their cruisers. The birth of the Mosquito fleet was not only an industrial story, it was a cultural one. America's genius was not to perfect the decisive weapon, but to flood the battlefield with many aircraft, tanks, ships, boats. The PT was a child of this abundance. Small, numerous, contemptible to traditionalists, yet impossible to ignore once the bites began to sting. The laughter of the Admirals still echoed across wardrooms in 1942. But in New Orleans and Bayonne, workers laid keel after keel, plank after plank, until squadrons of mosquitoes buzzed toward the front. The stage was set for the first blood. The first sting came in darkness. January 24, 1942, the Battle of Balikpapan. Japanese transports crowded the harbour, having landed troops on the oil-rich shores of Borneo. Heavy cruisers stood guard, their guns silent after days of dominance. The rising sun flew triumphant over the Indies. Into this setting crept the Americans, wooden, gasoline-filled, fragile. The boats were small and anonymous, PT-31, PT-32, PT-34 and PT-35 of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. They had been dispatched to the Philippines in December, already battered by losses, fueled by desperation. In official reports, they were minor units. In Japanese perception, they were not units at all. But that night, Balikpapan would remember them. Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, commander of Squadron 3, recorded in his action report preserved at the National Archives. We approached convoy at 0200 hours, visibility poor, moon obscured, sea calm. Launched torpedoes at transports, observed explosions. Enemy returned fire with machine guns, inaccurate. Boats withdrew undamaged. It was a modest action, tactically. A handful of Japanese transports sunk or crippled. But symbolically, it was the first recorded sinking of enemy vessels by USPT boats in the war. The Japanese response was telling. The 4th Air Group's captured war diary, translated by Allied interpreters after the war, mentioned the incident almost dismissively. Enemy small motorcraft attacked transports, some damage sustained. Enemy boats fled swiftly, no details, no analysis, no alarm. To the Japanese, the loss of a few transports was regrettable but irrelevant. The main fleet remained untouched. The mosquitoes had bitten, but the elephant still slept. Yet to the U.S. Navy, the bite mattered. The Naval History and Heritage Command's H. Graham 018 later summarized. At Balikpapan, PT boats demonstrated their capacity to strike in confined waters, inflict disproportionate damage, and escape by speed. Though small in scale, the action vindicated the tactical doctrine of harassment and ambush. The contrast in interpretation reveals the heart of the story. The Japanese saw nothing. The Americans saw proof of concept. And what of the boats themselves? Consider the scene on PT-34. 12 men, most in their early 20s, crouched behind thin planking as tracer fire arced overhead. The engines roared so loud they drowned out shouted commands. The torpedoes, slung on deck racks, were released by crude manual levers. Sailors pushed them overboard with bare hands, praying that the gyroscopes would arm properly. Then they waited. Seconds stretched. And then an orange fireball as a Japanese transport erupted. its hull rent by 386 pounds of TNT. It was a primitive ballet of courage. The Japanese, for their part, were humiliated less by the sinking than by the manner of it. A cruiser's broadside they could respect, a destroyer's torpedoes they could admire. But to be struck by plywood mosquitoes, this was embarrassing. Post-war interrogations revealed the disdain. Rear Admiral Shigeji Kaneko admitted in 1946, "We lost transports at Balikpapan." But the staff did not consider the incident worthy of discussion. It was viewed as accident, not as demonstration of enemy capability. This contempt, repeated endlessly in staff meetings, ensured no counter-doctrine developed. No new tactics for protecting convoys from small craft were adopted. Destroyers were not trained to sweep shallows aggressively at night. Radar was not prioritized. Japan laughed, and laughter substituted for adaptation. Meanwhile, the Americans learned. Squadron reports noted the difficulty of launching torpedoes from rolling racks, the vulnerability of gasoline tanks, the need for better armament against aircraft. Within months, PTS were retrofitted with 20mm Oerlikons, sometimes even salvaged army field guns lashed to their decks. Improvisation became doctrine. Balikpapan also exposed the asymmetry of cost. The Japanese lost thousands of tons of shipping, vital to sustaining their advance. The Americans risked 4 plywood boats worth less than the fittings of a single cruiser's wardroom. Economically, the exchange ratio was grotesque. In an age when America could replace losses monthly and Japan could not, every such trade favoured the United States. The event echoed themes familiar across theatres. Just as the P-47 would prove that durability mattered more than elegance, just as Coca-Cola in Soviet camps symbolized industrial abundance, so too did Balikpapan reveal a truth. War rewarded not the biggest, but the most adaptable. To the Japanese, PT boats were beneath contempt. To the Americans, they were expendable innovation. That difference in perception would widen with every month of the Pacific War. For the men on the boats, though, theory mattered less than survival. Lieutenant Robert Kelly, engineer on PT-32, later recalled, "Every time we went out, we expected not to come back. We sat on thousands of gallons of gas in a wooden box. One hit and you were gone. But when that torpedo struck and we saw the enemy ship go up, we believed it was worth it. That belief became fuel. Balikpapan did not change the war's outcome, but it seeded confidence in the mosquito fleet. The after-action reports circulated through the Bureau of Ships, the Office of Naval Operations, even the White House. Roosevelt read them with satisfaction. The experiment had worked. The Japanese still laughed. The combined fleet's official war diary for January 1942 made no mention of PT boats. Strategic attention remained on battleships, carriers, and oil supplies. In Tokyo, senior officers debated how to counter the American carrier threat. No one wasted time on plywood. Thus, the stage was set. The Americans had found their sting, however small. The Japanese refused to feel it. The first blood of Balikpapan was not decisive, but it was prophetic. Like a mosquito bite that swells unnoticed until fever sets in, the strike foreshadowed a sickness that would afflict the Imperial Navy throughout the Solomons campaign, death not by duel, but by 1,000 stings. The laugh of the Admirals still echoed in wardrooms. But in the black waters of the Indies, the plywood mosquitoes had drawn blood. If Balikpapan was a warning ignored, the Solomons became a wound that refused to heal. From 1942 through 1943, the waters around Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Vella Gulf turned into what Japanese sailors called the slot, a corridor of death where night battles raged and supplies bled through narrow seas. Here the plywood mosquitoes bred. The Solomons campaign elevated PT boats from experiment to instrument. Squadrons 2, 3, 5, and later 9 deployed to Tulagi and Rendova. Their bases little more than coconut-fringed coves with makeshift piers and fuel drums stacked beneath camouflage nets. The boats, scarred from tropical sun and salt spray, patrolled nightly, engines rumbling like angry hornets. The Japanese still laughed, at first. Interrogation transcripts from 1945 reveal the prevailing attitude. Commander Naomasa Sakonju admitted, "We referred to them as toy boats. They were so small, our officers often ignored reports of their presence. A destroyer captain would not lower his dignity to chase them." That arrogance had consequences. Consider the logistical lifeline Japan called the Tokyo Express. Night after night, destroyers sprinted down the slot, carrying supplies and reinforcements to Guadalcanal. American air power made daylight resupply impossible, but under the moon, destroyers, sleek, fast, heavily armed, raced through black waters, throwing cargo barrels overboard to float ashore. And in those same waters lurked PT boats. Their doctrine was harassment, not annihilation. PTS were never expected to sink destroyers outright. Their orders, as preserved in 13th Fighter Command debriefings, were clear. Engage enemy supply lines, force evasion, deny efficiency, inflict cumulative damage. It worked. Japanese destroyer logs, captured after the war and translated by Allied interpreters, reveal a pattern of frustration. Enemy small craft present. Torpedoes launched, evasive maneuvers required. Arrival delayed. Fuel consumption high. Every delay mattered. Destroyers burning precious fuel on evasive zigzags arrived with less to give. Supplies offloaded in chaos were scattered, lost or destroyed by follow-up air raids. The PT boats might score only occasional torpedo hits, but their strategic value lay in multiplying friction. Naval History and Heritage Command summaries describe this effect bluntly. PT squadrons became force multipliers, each sortie disrupted far beyond its immediate damage. Their presence compelled caution, consuming time and resources Japan could not spare. And sometimes the harassment drew blood. On the night of August 1st, 1943, PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, joined 15 other boats in an ambush near Blackett Strait. The battle is remembered for Kennedy's survival after his boat was cut in half by IJN Amagiri, but the larger context often fades. That night's engagement saw PTS swarm, launching dozens of torpedoes. Most missed. But the sheer chaos forced Japanese destroyers to break formation, reducing efficiency of supply. Kennedy's boat paid the price, but the doctrine was fulfilled. Another night, another ambush, another drain. Japanese officers would later admit the psychological toll. In post-war testimony collected during the U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium of 1962, Captain Yasumi Toyama confessed, "We came to fear the dark waters, not for the American cruisers, not for the carriers, but for the mosquitoes. They struck without warning. They cost us time. They made every journey uncertain. This was the wooden thorn, not fatal in a single blow, but festering, constant, sapping confidence and energy." To grasp the scale of contrast, imagine a Japanese heavy cruiser, 10,000 tons of steel, bristling with 8-inch guns, armour and machinery that cost millions of yen and years to construct. Against it, an 80-foot PT boat of plywood and nails, costing less than the cruiser's fire control system. One could level a city block, the other carried only 4 torpedoes, manual launch, and a handful of .50 caliber machine guns. And yet in the confined channels of the Solomons, the balance tipped. The cruiser could not maneuver freely. Its heavy guns could not depress low enough to target a mosquito skimming the waves. The PT boat, darting at 40 knots, exploited darkness, reefs, and rain squalls. The Japanese laughed at the imbalance of size. They did not see the imbalance of context. American reports captured the irony. Commander Russell Smith of Squadron 5 wrote in 1943, "Our boats are insignificant compared to their warships, but the sea is not about size. It is about time, fuel, nerves, and persistence. By these measures we are winning. winning not by duels, but by attrition. The Solomons campaign consumed Japanese destroyers at an unsustainable rate. According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific Theater section, by late 1943, Japan had lost over 24 destroyers to cumulative causes: combat with PT boats, airstrikes timed during resupply chaos, fuel starvation, and forced overexertion. Each loss eroded the fleet's ability to function as a coherent fighting force. And behind these statistics lay the plywood fleet, buzzing nightly, unkillable not because they survived, but because they were replaceable. America produced PT boats at hundreds per year. Japan could not produce destroyers at the same rate. Each engagement, however indecisive in isolation, shifted the equation toward collapse. Still, the ridicule lingered. Post-war interrogations reveal how deep the contempt remained, even in failure. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commander of the Tokyo Express, acknowledged losses but sneered, "It was not the PT boats themselves that troubled us. It was American aircraft. The boats were a nuisance, not a decisive weapon." He was half right. Alone, PT boats rarely achieved decisive results. But as part of the ecosystem of American pressure, air, sea, and supply interdiction, they were the thorn that made every other weapon more effective. And for the men aboard them, nuisance was enough. Lieutenant William Liebenau, skipper of PT-157, later said, "We were never going to sink the Yamato, but if we could keep one transport from landing its cargo, or make a destroyer burn extra fuel, we had done our job. Death by 1,000 cuts. That was our war. The 1,000 cuts accumulated. By the end of 1943, Guadalcanal was secure, New Georgia taken, and Japan's ability to reinforce the Solomons shattered. The Tokyo Express had been bled into irrelevance. The plywood mosquitoes had proven themselves more than a joke. They were not decisive weapons of annihilation. They were something subtler, instruments of erosion. And in war, erosion matters. As the Solomons campaign ended, both sides took stock. The Americans expanded PT squadrons, refining tactics, improving torpedoes, and adding heavier guns. The Japanese, still bound by contempt, adjusted little. In their diaries, the dismissive phrase persisted: "Enemy motorboats interfered." But beneath the ridicule lay the truth. The wooden thorn had pierced deep. The Solomons proved that even in an ocean dominated by steel giants, plywood could change the course of a campaign. The laughing admirals still mocked the mosquitoes, but their cruisers sailed less often, their destroyers carried fewer supplies, their soldiers ashore went hungrier. The thorn had done its work. By late 1943, the slot was no longer simply a corridor of water. To Japanese sailors, it had become a haunted place, a liquid graveyard where each journey meant gambling against unseen predators. Officially, destroyer captains still dismissed PT boats as nuisances, but diaries, captured and translated by Allied translators and interpreters section ATIS, reveal another truth. One lieutenant wrote after a December 1943 run, "We loaded food and ammunition, we expected aircraft. Instead came small boats attacking from shadows. Their wakes glowed like fireflies, then torpedoes came. We evaded, but men whispered afterward, 'Why do we risk death for such scraps?' This fear, rarely admitted publicly, grew with each night action. By the end of 1943, USPT squadrons in the Solomons had launched over 400 night sorties. Their kill tally was modest. A few destroyers damaged or sunk, dozens of barges destroyed. But their interdiction effect was disproportionate. Naval History and Heritage Command's H. Graham 018 summarized. The cumulative pressure of PT operations did not lie in tonnage sunk, but in erosion of Japanese logistical confidence. Destroyers of the vaunted Tokyo Express now ran gauntlets of ambush. Instead of racing straight down the slot, they were forced into circuitous routes. Refueling and coordination became nightmares. Every evasion burned more fuel, fuel Japan could not replace. The Red Ball Express of Europe had its mirror in the Pacific, Japanese supply chains hemorrhaging under harassment. At the heart of PT warfare was the Mark 8 torpedo, old, heavy, and temperamental. Derived from World War I designs, it was far from ideal. US destroyers cursed its shortfalls. PT crews had to fire them from primitive roll-off racks. Yet even these outdated weapons terrified Japanese sailors. Interrogations in 1945 showed captains overestimating PT torpedo effectiveness. One claimed, "We believed they had magical torpedoes." At night, any wake could be death. The irony was brutal. PT boats often fired spreads that missed by hundreds of yards, but perception mattered more than mathematics. A single near miss, a flash of phosphorescent wake, could force a destroyer into violent evasive maneuvers. Those maneuvers disorganized formations and disrupted supply offloading. Thus, the wooden mosquito carried a sting out of proportion to its accuracy. Japanese records list more than 20 destroyers lost in the Solomons, some to air attack, some to surface action. Others run aground while dodging PT ambushes. Barges and supply craft fared worse. ATIS compiled testimony from survivors describing nights where flotillas of 50 small supply barges were reduced to scattered wrecks after PT swarms descended. Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly of Squadron 9 recalled, "We would strike like wolves, 2 boats per target, torpedoes first, then close with machine guns. Barges burned like lanterns. We counted success not in tons, but in absence, supplies never reaching their troops." For Japanese infantry on Guadalcanal and New Georgia, the consequences were starvation and disease. One sergeant's diary, later found in a jungle hut, read simply, "We fight Americans and hunger." Hunger is worse. The slot became the artery that never carried enough blood. The laughter of 1942 had long since curdled. Japanese interrogations after the war repeatedly returned to the theme of morale. Captain Haruo Ariga told US interviewers in 1946, "Our men did not fear cruisers, they feared mosquitoes. The cruisers we could see, fight and die against with honor. The mosquitoes came from darkness, left us helpless. Their very smallness insulted us. That we, with mighty ships, should be harassed by toy boats, this wounded pride." American commanders understood this dynamic. Vice Admiral William Halsey described PTS as psychological destroyers. He wrote in a December 1943 dispatch, "Enemy cannot sail with confidence. A fleet is only as strong as the spirit of its crews. The PTS gnaw that spirit nightly." By mid-1943, PTS had shifted tactics. Early failures of torpedo accuracy led skippers to close range, sometimes within 600 yards. They fired spreads manually, often under direct gunfire. To increase effectiveness, crews mounted additional .50 caliber guns, 20mm cannon, and eventually even 40mm Bofors stripped from downed aircraft or army surplus. These modifications turned PTS into hybrids, part torpedo boat, part gunboat. Against barges, they were devastating. Against destroyers, they forced caution. Japanese destroyer crews reported unease at these swarming attacks. Even when boats were destroyed, others would slip through, firing torpedoes in confusion. "We fired main guns uselessly," one diary lamented, like trying to swat mosquitoes with a sword. The night of August 6th to 7th, 1943, illustrated PT impact indirectly. That night, American destroyers ambushed a Tokyo Express run, sinking 3 Japanese destroyers. PT boats had been operating in the area earlier, harassing and shadowing Japanese movements. Reports from the Japanese side confirmed they believed PT boats signaled larger forces. Destroyer captains approached cautiously, burning time and fuel. The decisive blow came from American destroyers, but the PTS had shaped the environment, herding prey, fraying nerves, forcing hesitation. As in Europe with fuel, America's ability to mass-produce PT boats contrasted with Japan's dwindling resources. The US built over 500 by 1943 alone. Japan could not replace even a fraction of its destroyer losses. The plywood hulls that Japanese admirals mocked were America's true advantage. They were cheap, quick to build, expendable. To lose one was regrettable, not catastrophic. To lose a destroyer was a national blow to Japan. Thus every clash, however small, favoured the Americans in the long run. By 1944, Japanese soldiers coined a bitter nickname, the Wooden Devils. They wrote letters home describing nights where engines buzzed like hornets, tracers stitched black water, and torpedoes churned phosphorescence into glowing death. The slot became synonymous with dread. Destroyer captains who once mocked PT boats now dreaded their patrol zones. Barges stopped running altogether. Starvation stalked the garrisons. The historian Richard Frank summarized, Guadalcanal was not won by PT boats. But Guadalcanal could not have been supplied if PT boats had not fought. Their denial of logistics was decisive in cumulative effect. By the end of 1943, the laughter was gone. The mighty cruisers still dwarfed the mosquitoes. But they rarely risked the slot anymore. To sail those waters was to risk humiliation at the hands of plywood and gasoline. The Admirals' laughter of 1942 echoed as bitter irony. The mosquitoes had grown into nightmares. By 1944, the plywood mosquitoes had achieved what few believed possible. Japanese admirals no longer laughed when PT boats prowled the darkness. The slot was littered with lost destroyers and burned-out barges. But a question lingered in Tokyo and Truk. Could these fragile craft of pine and gasoline truly threaten cruisers, the armoured giants that embodied Japan's naval prestige? The answer came, not all at once, but through a sequence of encounters that revealed how even mighty cruisers could bleed when scratched often enough by wooden thorns. The earliest significant cruiser engagement came in the confused nights off Guadalcanal in 1942. PT-37 and PT-44, both of Squadron 3, stumbled into the path of Japanese heavy cruiser Kako and her escorts. Their torpedoes missed, Mark 8s fired too hastily. But the mere presence of PTS forced the cruisers to zigzag, slowing their withdrawal. Hours later, American submarines intercepted the same formation, sinking Kako. Admiral Tanaka later admitted in post-war testimony, "Our formation was disordered from those small boats. Their interference delayed our course." It may be that this permitted the submarine to strike. Indirect, yes, but it was the first hint that cruisers were not immune. The real shock came in October 1943 near Vella. PT-126 and PT-136, running low on fuel, intercepted Japanese light cruiser Sendai and her escorts. The PTs closed to suicidal range, firing torpedoes at less than 700 yards. Sendai evaded, but in the chaos collided with destroyer Shigur. Minutes later, American destroyers arrived, finishing off Sendai. Again, the PTS had not delivered the coup de grace, but they had sown the confusion that doomed a cruiser. Navy dispatches recorded the lesson. Enemy heavy units are not immune from harassment. PT presence multiplies opportunities for decisive action. A cruiser's strength was range and armour. Its weakness was agility. Against a battleship it could manoeuvre. Against aircraft it could scatter flak. But against a mosquito boat darting at 40 knots, the cruiser's turrets turned too slowly, its guns depressed too little, its searchlights blinded itself. Captured diaries make this clear. One officer aboard Myoko wrote, "At night, when torpedo wakes appeared, the captain ordered hard turns. The ship heaved like a drunkard. To fight small boats with big guns was folly. We wasted shells, blinded ourselves with star shells, and gained nothing. This was the paradox. To fight PTS meant wasting energy and exposing one's position. To ignore them meant risking a torpedo. Either choice eroded the cruiser's dominance. Perhaps the most haunting arena was Iron Bottom Sound, where the seabed became the grave of so many capital ships. PT boats prowled nightly, often arriving after major battles to snap at retreating giants. On the night of November 13, 1942, after the bloody naval battle of Guadalcanal, PTs chased damaged Japanese cruisers limping northward. They launched torpedoes at Maya and Kinugasa. The latter escaped only to be sunk the next day by aircraft, but American reports credited PT harassment with preventing timely withdrawal. Japanese survivors later testified that the PT boats had been ghosts in the night, striking when morale was lowest, amplifying despair. The moment of ultimate vindication came in 1944, when PT 373 of Squadron 18 achieved what few thought possible. Operating near Halmahera, she and her squadron ambushed a convoy including the light cruiser Kinu. Accounts differ, but multiple US sources credit torpedoes from PT boats as damaging Kinu, later sunk by aircraft. It was not the single-handed kill Hollywood might crave. But the symbolism was unmistakable. A plywood mosquito had stung a cruiser badly enough to send her limping into the crosshairs of other predators. Naval historians note the statistical modesty of such actions. Yet in Japanese post-war interrogations, officers remembered them vividly. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi admitted, "Even our cruisers could not pass untroubled." We had to account for the mosquitoes. By mid-1944, Japan had lost not just destroyers, but cruisers in cumulative attrition. Some were sunk directly by aircraft or submarines, but PTS often featured in the chain of cause. They delayed departures, forced evasions, disorganized formations, and lured ships into traps. The post-war US Strategic Bombing Survey put it bluntly. The Japanese Navy never devised an effective counter to PT boats. Their continued contempt cost them operational efficiency and, in several cases, heavy units. For the PT crews, facing a cruiser was equal parts terror and exhilaration. Lieutenant John Bulkley, Medal of Honor recipient and later commander of PTS in the Philippines, recalled, "When a cruiser's searchlights found you, you felt naked as a bug on a skillet. But you pressed in anyway because that was the job. We knew the odds. We counted on speed, surprise, and guts." His words echoed across the squadrons. To close within 1,000 yards of a cruiser was madness, but it was precisely that madness which kept the myth alive, that wood could humble steel. By late 1944, the strategic map had shifted. American carriers and battleships now dominated, and PT boats increasingly shifted to barge busting in the Philippines. Yet the reputation earned in the Solomons endured. When Japanese cruisers attempted resupply runs to Leyte in October, American PT squadrons harassed them just as they had in the slot. Torpedoes often missed, but the cruiser Abukuma was crippled after repeated harassment and airstrikes, limping home only to be finished later. Again, the mosquitoes had not killed outright, but they had carried infection. In Tokyo war rooms of 1942, officers had laughed at the notion that plywood boats could touch mighty cruisers. By 1945, those same cruisers were sunk, scuttled, or rusting in useless anchorages. PT boats did not destroy them single-handedly, but they had played their part in the strangulation of Japanese sea power. As Captain Yasumi Toyama admitted in 1946, "We were humiliated. To be forced to fear such craft was shameful, yet the shame was real. We lost our cruisers not to equals, but to mosquitoes." The wooden thorn had pierced the giant's armour, not cleanly, not decisively, but deeply enough to fester. The mighty cruisers had not fallen in duels of broadside gunfire, but in nights of confusion where the laughter of admirals turned to silence. Steel had not been sunk by steel alone. It had been hounded, harassed, and humbled by plywood. and in that humiliation lay the true victory of the PT boats. By October 1944, the war had shifted to the Philippines, and the Imperial Japanese Navy faced its greatest gamble, the counter-offensive at Leyte Gulf. Carriers, battleships, and cruisers steamed into what became the largest naval battle in history. It was a clash of titans, but in the shadows, plywood boats still prowled, their significance quieter, yet no less corrosive. As Japanese fleets converged on Leyte, American PT squadrons had already established forward bases in the archipelago. They patrolled Surigao Strait, Ormoc Bay, and the coasts of Leyte itself. Reports from the 77th Naval Construction Battalion describe makeshift PT bases hacked from jungle, palm-thatched huts, crude wooden piers, and fuel drums hidden under camouflage netting. The Japanese expected to duel with carriers and battleships. Instead, their advance was first reported by PTS lurking in Surigao Strait. At 2200 hours on October 24, 1944, PT-132 and PT-134 made radar contact with Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force, including battleships Yamashiro and Fuso and heavy cruiser Mogami. Outgunned beyond comprehension, the PTS attacked anyway. They launched torpedoes at ranges under 2,000 yards. None hit, but their contact reports raced ahead by radio, warning American admirals of the coming assault. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf arrayed his battleships across Surigao Strait, setting the stage for the decisive crossing the T. Official Navy after-action reports state flatly, the PT boats gave the first warning. Without them, our deployment would have been compromised. Thus, at Leyte, PT boats did not sink cruisers with their own torpedoes. They delivered information, the currency of victory. In the weeks after the main battle, PT boats carried the war into Ormoc Bay, where Japanese destroyers and cruisers tried desperately to land reinforcements for the doomed garrison. Here the mosquitoes turned feral. In November 1944, PT-491 and PT-492 attacked a convoy under cover of darkness. The Japanese light cruiser Kinu, already damaged from air raids, limped into the bay with destroyer escort Uranami. PT torpedoes splashed around them, forcing evasions. The next day, US aircraft found the disrupted convoy, sinking both Kinu and Uranami. Again, the PTS had not delivered the fatal strike, but they had weakened the prey. Navy historian Samuel Eliot Morrison summarized, "The PTS pinned them, the planes finished them." The Japanese saw it differently. In a 1945 interrogation, Captain Masami Kobayashi lamented, "It was dishonor enough to lose ships to American carriers. To be driven to ruin by motorboats, that was intolerable." For PT crews, Leyte was a brutal crucible. They fought in confined waters, hemmed by shore batteries, air attack, and superior surface forces. Gasoline fires consumed boats hit by shell fire. Crews bailed with their bare hands or leapt into shark-infested waters. Lieutenant Robert Searles of PT-490 later recalled, "It was madness. We charged cruisers with slingshots, but every time we went out, we told ourselves, if we can force them to turn once, if we can delay by 5 minutes, then somebody else has a chance to finish them." Their courage lay not in victories counted in ships sunk, but in the willingness to face annihilation nightly. Captured Japanese records and diaries reveal the creeping despair. One officer in the 16th Naval Transport Group wrote in December 1944, "Every attempt to reach Ormoc is met with these cursed motorboats. They attack like demons, careless of death. Our soldiers call them devils of plywood." By this stage, Japanese cruisers were no longer the hunters of 1942. Fuel shortages, constant air attack, and relentless PT harassment turned them into prey. The balance of terror had reversed. The cumulative effect of PT operations in Leyte was stark. According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, of the 11 Japanese attempts to reinforce Leyte between November and December 1944, none succeeded in full. Losses included 6 destroyers, a cruiser, and over 20 transports. While aircraft sank the majority, PT boats forced dispersal, broke formations, and added confusion that multiplied American effectiveness. Admiral Thomas Kincaid praised them in a December 1944 communiqué. "Our PT squadrons have written an epic of courage. Though small in stature, their impact upon the campaign has been vast." By early 1945, the Japanese cruiser force was a shadow. Most survivors withdrew to the home islands, starving for fuel, unable to sortie. Yet the humiliation remained. In post-war Japanese naval circles, the very mention of PT boats elicited grimaces. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, a Japanese officer who had served aboard the cruiser Tone admitted publicly for the first time, "We never forgave those boats. They were beneath us, yet they crippled us. The shame was worse than defeat. The plywood mosquitoes had not just stung, they had scarred." The Leyte campaign proved the final chapter in the cruiser's humiliation. No admiral laughed now. The war that began with arrogance ended with bitterness, as cruisers once symbols of might were chased into oblivion by boats the size of fishing trawlers. The shadows of those encounters lingered long after the last PT boat was decommissioned. For the men who served on them, and the Japanese who endured them, the memory was permanent. Even the proudest ships of steel could be humbled by plywood. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the plywood mosquitoes that had harassed, delayed, and embarrassed the Imperial Japanese Navy slipped quietly into history. Most PT boats were scrapped, burned, or left to rot in forgotten lagoons. But their memory lingered, in the men who fought aboard them, in the Japanese officers who once mocked them, and in the strange arithmetic of naval warfare that showed how wood and gasoline could humble steel and gunpowder. In the months after surrender, Allied interrogators sat across from Japanese admirals and captains now stripped of their uniforms and illusions. Among the captured war diaries translated by the Allied translator and interpreter section, references to PT boats are frequent, often bitter. A 1945 interrogation transcript from Captain Tomiji Koyanagi, who had served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Kurita at Leyte, is blunt. "We planned for your carriers, your battleships. We never planned for the motorboats. They made our movements uncertain, our timetables false. Our heavy ships wasted ammunition chasing them. They forced delay when delay was fatal." Other officers described the sense of dishonour. Rear Admiral Masami Kobayashi, in a Tokyo prison cell, confessed, "To be sunk by air power was misfortune. To be caught by submarines was an old risk of war. But to be defeated by plywood, that was humiliation." The irony stung. The very weapons Japan had dismissed as toys had become avatars of American ingenuity, symbols of a war that Japan could not hope to win. In the United States, PT boats carried a different legacy. John F. Kennedy's wartime service on PT 109 immortalized them in American memory, casting the mosquito boats as romantic symbols of youthful daring. But for the sailors who had faced cruisers and destroyers in the dark, romance was a thin veil over terror. Veterans' memoirs collected at the Naval History and Heritage Command reveal a recurring theme: disbelief that their fragile craft had faced such odds. One officer of Squadron 21 wrote, "Every time we went out, we expected not to return. Yet somehow the plywood kept floating, and somehow the torpedoes kept running. The statistics told the story." According to Navy records, PTs claimed over 300,000 tons of Japanese shipping sunk or crippled. While historians debate exact numbers, many sinkings were shared with air or submarine attacks. The psychological toll was undeniable. Japanese officers themselves acknowledged that PT harassment magnified the effect of air power, creating an ever-present fear of ambush. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey drove home the lesson. America had built 531 PT boats during the war, each costing around $100,000. Japan had invested millions of tons of steel and tens of thousands of men in its heavy cruisers. Yet in battle after battle, the cruisers failed to deliver decisive blows, while the mosquitoes shaped outcomes far beyond their size. The comparison echoed the themes of abundance and improvisation. PTS ran on gasoline engines borrowed from aircraft. They carried weapons and electronics often cobbled together from available stores. But mass production meant they were everywhere, off Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, across New Guinea, at Leyte. Where the Japanese saw weakness, America saw expendable ubiquity. A 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation and Naval History Symposium recorded one Japanese admiral admitting, "We built masterpieces and lost them. You built mosquitoes and won." The PT boat's lessons influenced navies long after the war. The Soviets, studying the Pacific campaigns, invested heavily in fast attack craft armed with torpedoes and later missiles. NATO navies countered with their own mosquito fleets. The wooden boats of World War II had foreshadowed an age where speed, stealth, and numbers could matter more than armour. Yet in Japan, the memory carried a different flavour. In memoirs published in the 1950s and 60s, former IJN officers often spoke of the shame inflicted by PT boats. Admiral Ugaki's diary, recovered after his death in a final kamikaze mission, noted bitterly, "Our proud cruisers burned under the guns of motorboats." Even in defeat, the sting of the mosquito was remembered. The mythology of the PT boat seeped into popular imagination. Hollywood dramatized PT-109, embedding the image of wooden craft dashing bravely against impossible odds. Veterans' reunions, recorded in the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, echoed with tales of torpedo runs and midnight chases. At that same reunion, a Japanese veteran of the cruiser Tone rose during a panel and said quietly, "I feared your carriers. I respected your submarines, but I hated your motorboats. They were always there, always biting, and we could not stop them." The room fell silent. The plywood mosquitoes had achieved a victory beyond tonnage. They had carved a place in the memory of friend and foe alike. In museums today, preserved PT boats sit beside battleship anchors and carrier models. Their wooden hulls appear fragile, almost laughable, until visitors read the placards and realize how these craft tangled with giants. The Smithsonian's records describe them as improbable predators of the Pacific. Veterans preferred another phrase, "the last thing the enemy laughed at." For the Japanese admirals who once scoffed, the laughter curdled into silence long before surrender. And for the American sailors who rode the fragile decks into gunfire, the memory was clear. Plywood and gasoline, wielded with courage, had rewritten the balance of naval war. History often remembers the largest ships, the grandest weapons, the decisive battles of steel and fire. Yet sometimes the story is written in smaller strokes, in mosquito bites that carried disease into the bloodstream of an empire. The PT boats never won a battle alone. They never matched ton for ton, gun for gun. But they harassed, delayed, reported, and struck until mighty cruisers were crippled, convoys scattered, and Japanese confidence shattered. In the end, the admiral's laughter was silenced by explosions in the night, by wakes cut across black water, by the sting of torpedoes from boats no larger than fishing trawlers. The plywood mosquitoes proved the paradox of the Pacific War. In a conflict defined by colossal machines, sometimes victory belonged to the smallest hunters.